since the Senator, my friend, has addressed me indirectly for my suggested hearing, an actual hearing on Guantanamo, I hope that he and I can both agree that paying $13 million a year to hold each detainee, each one in Gitmo, is certainly not a wise expenditure of taxpayers' resources in fighting terrorism. Our next senator to speak, Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Last month, I joined a number of my colleagues in sending a letter to President Biden that urged the administration to review and overhaul United States counterterrorism policy to center on human rights and the protection of civilians, and align with United States and international law prioritize non-lethal tools to address conflict and fragility, and using force only when it's lawful and as a last resort. Does anyone on this panel disagree with those basic principles? Okay, thank you. The letter outlined numbers that we've been discussing today, namely that as many as 48,000 civilians across 7 countries were reportedly killed by United States strikes over the last 2 decades. And as you all know, on January 27th, General Austin published a memorandum on civilian harm mitigation and response. Does anyone on this panel take issue with the principles and tactics and strategy that General Austin articulated in that memorandum? Again, no one disagrees. I want to commend the administration for addressing these issues. I think we need to reach consensus on those basic principles in the way that they are implemented in the field, in combat, in the arena. And members of this panel, some of you have direct experience with the exigencies and challenges of the battlefield. Let me ask Ms. Shamsi, do you think the administration is moving quickly enough to implement those principles?
Unfortunately not, Senator Blumenthal, and thank you for your question. I think it's also important just to clarify a couple of things that I think also your letter helpfully raised and pointed out. You know, one is that when we're talking about this program, what are we actually talking about? We have been using drones, but also other airstrikes in recognized armed conflict, for example, in Afghanistan, where my client's loved ones so recently were killed. And in fact, it's more airstrikes not using drones that have happened in Afghanistan. And in places like that, what applies is the law of war. In other countries where drones started being launched, the US wasn't at war. And so when we're talking about where we stand and what the Biden administration is doing, it's really important to step back and say 20 years later, when we look at how the concerns that you and your colleagues so importantly and rightly raised in your letter, how are they going to be addressed going forward strategically, taking into account the costs and consequences? It's so important that, as you pointed out, to take into account where Congress has authorized war and what that conduct has been, and where the executive branch unilaterally took on the authority to start using drones or other weapons system, with what costs and consequences, and how does Congress take back its power to address the things that you raised?
I agree with you that Congress should be taking back, or at least safeguarding, its authority in many of these areas, which we have foregone. General Jumper, do you agree with Secretary Austin that a center of excellence to implement these principles and policies is a good idea?
Yes, sir, I do.
And do you think more should be done?
Sir, I think that one thing in my experience that has not happened when we get into, and I think Afghanistan is an excellent example, is that when we transition from the military operations, which in Afghanistan, the military mission was essentially accomplished in a matter of months, we transition to nation building. We don't have the presence of the other agencies of the government to implement that change in direction. And it often falls to the military to do things that military, quite frankly, don't do very well. And so it's the full participation of the government when it's appropriate, I think is something else that has to be seriously looked at. It has to be funded. It has to be governed appropriately and with proper oversight, of course.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimony. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Next is Senator Hawley.